$200 billion, 12 theme parks, Marvel, Star Wars, Mickey Mouse, the single most recognized character in the history of cinema. Over 230,000 people going to work every day for a company that has shaped the imagination of every generation alive on this planet. All of it, every single piece of it, started with a 6-year-old boy sitting under a tree in Missouri, drawing field mice on the back of a newspaper. Picture that boy, Marceline, Missouri, 1908, a stub of pencil. A father standing in the doorway who has made it very clear that drawing is not work, that drawing will not feed a family, that drawing will not build anything that lasts. A stern, restless man who has never once held a job long enough to stop moving, and who has already decided, before his son has had a chance to decide for himself, exactly who this boy is going to become. The boy draws anyway. Now hold both images at the same time, the tree, the pencil, the father, who doesn't believe in him, and the $200 billion empire. Feel the distance between them. That distance is what this entire story is about, and by the end of it, you'll understand exactly how he crossed it and what it cost him. Before Walt Disney built the most recognizable entertainment brand in human history, he went bankrupt. He lived in his own office because he couldn't afford rent. He had a character stolen from him by a man who was certain, absolutely certain, that Walt could be replaced. That man was wrong. But Walt very nearly wasn't there to prove it. And in 1941, at the height of his power, Walt Disney made a mistake so human, so understandable, and so expensive that 200 of his own employees walked out and picketed his studio with signs that read, "Snow White and the 700 Dwarfs." Here is the question that is going to drive everything you are about to hear. What does it actually cost to refuse to be told what you're worth? The answer is coming. But first, you need to understand where he started, and if you enjoy these stories, the best way to support the channel is by subscribing and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps. Thank you. Now let's get into it. The Boy Who Drew Everything. Walter Elias Disney was born on December 5, 1901, in the Hermosa neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. Fourth child. 3 older brothers, Herbert, Raymond, and Roy, 1 younger sister, Ruth. His father, Elias, was a carpenter, a farmer, a building contractor, and a subscriber to the socialist newspaper The Appeal to Reason, a man of strong opinions, modest achievements, and perpetual motion. He could not stay in one place, could not make peace with whatever life had handed him, always convinced the next town or venture would be the one that stuck. It never was. His mother, Flora, had been a school teacher before she married. She was quieter, warmer, and considerably more shrewd in her understanding of her youngest son than her husband ever chose to be. That difference mattered more than anyone knew at the time. In 1906, when Walt was 4, Elias moved the family again, this time to a 40-acre farm outside Marceline, Missouri, a small Midwestern town of wide streets and slow time. He had bought the land from the widow of a Civil War veteran. Just like that, the Chicago boy was a farm boy, and for the next 4 years that farm was the whole world. Walt Disney would say, in interviews and letters and speeches right up until the end of his life, that Marceline was the only childhood he ever had. He wrote in 1938, "More things of importance happened to me in Marceline than have happened since, or are likely to in the future." A man who would one day hold 22 Oscars, saying that the defining years of his life were the ones spent on a Missouri farm before he was 9. You have to take that seriously. Here is what happened. A boy made friends with animals because there were no other children close enough to play with. His particular favorite was a pig named Porker. He would climb on her back and ride her across the yard. He loved her so completely that when he was a grown man, running one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood, he would say that Porker had been the direct model for the foolish pig in 3 Little Pigs. Walt Disney didn't invent his world. He remembered it. He sat under a cottonwood tree at the edge of the property, a tree that still stands today, registered as a historic tree by American forests. And he drew rabbits, field mice, squirrels, deer, whatever moved in the grass at his feet. He drew in the dirt with sticks when he had no paper. He drew on the sides of barns when he thought no one was looking. But someone was always looking. A retired doctor in the neighborhood had a horse he was fond of, and he asked the boy if he could draw it. Walt drew the horse. The doctor paid him. Walt was 7 years old. So here is the question. What does a 7-year-old do when someone pays him to draw a horse? Most children pocket the coin and move on. Walt Disney went home and drew more. His father, characteristically, was unimpressed. Elias Disney believed in labor you could feel, wood you could cut, earth you could turn. When Walt grew up to become the most famous animator in the history of cinema, Elias still could not consider it a real job. That withholding never stopped mattering, in ways that drove Walt forward and, in the end, cost him. But Walt's mother saw something. In one of the rare moments she successfully overruled her husband, Flora convinced Elias to buy the boy colored pencils and drawing paper. That was the gift. Walt later described it as one of the most significant moments of his young life. He spent every spare minute after that doing the thing his father called a hobby, and Walt was beginning to understand was a calling. In 1910, Elias fell ill with typhoid fever and the farm had to be sold. The family moved to Kansas City, where Elias bought a newspaper delivery route for the Kansas City Star. 700 daily customers, 600 more on Sundays. He put Roy and Walt to work immediately. They were up at 3:30 in the morning, walking the route in any weather. In Missouri winter, that meant temperatures that cracked the skin on your hands before dawn. Elias paid them nothing. It was family work. Walt later said that the habits and compulsions of his adult life, the perfectionism, the relentless drive, the difficulty letting others rest when there was still something to be done, were formed in those pre-dawn hours. He was learning something his father never intended to teach him, that you could endure anything if you believed there was something worth enduring for. He kept drawing through all of it. In Kansas City, he traded drawings to the local barber for free haircuts. He took weekend classes at the Kansas City Art Institute. At 16, he dropped out of school, tried to enlist in the Army, was rejected for being underage, and joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps instead. He spent a year in France after the war's end, driving officials and dignitaries. But the ambulance he drove was covered, stem to stern, not in standard camouflage, but in drawings and cartoons. Even in the wreckage of the First World War, he could not stop making things. He came home in 1919 with no money, no degree, and no plan. Just the absolute certainty that he was going to make cartoons for a living. The world had decided what a farm boy from Marceline was supposed to become. He had other ideas. The man who lost a rabbit and found a mouse. Kansas City, 1921. Walt Disney is 19 years old. He has borrowed a camera. He is making short animated clips, less than a minute each, that he calls laughograms. Satirical cartoons about Kansas City potholes and police scandals and the minor indignities of Midwestern public life. He sells them to the Newman theater chain. They play before the main feature. People laugh. Could this actually work? Could a farm boy from Marceline, with no formal training, no money, and a father who has never approved of a single thing he has done, could he actually build something from this? He decides to find out. On June 28, 1921, he incorporates Laughogram Films in the state of Missouri. He raises $15,000 from local investors, men who had seen the Newman theater clips and believed in him enough to write a check. He hires a small team. He moves into the second floor of the McConaughey building on East 31st Street and begins producing animated fairy tales. Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, Cinderella, modernized, funny, distinctly his own. And then the money runs out. A distributor called Pictorial Clubs of Tennessee had contracted for 6 shorts. They paid a $100 advance, $100, against a full production contract, and then went bankrupt before paying another cent. Just like that, Laugh-O-Gram Films was insolvent. What happened next is important, not just as biography, but as the foundation of everything that came after. Walt Disney, 21 years old, could not afford his apartment. He moved into the studio office. He bathed once a week at Union Station, which had public facilities and cost nothing. He lived on whatever food he could find, reportedly beans. And in the desk where he slept and worked and refused to give up, there was a mouse. He began leaving crumbs for it at night. The mouse grew tame. It would come to the edge of his desk and sit there in the lamplight while Walt worked on the last cartoon he would ever make in Kansas City. An unfinished reel called Alice's Wonderland, blending a live-action girl with an animated world. Think about that image for a moment. A broke 21-year-old sleeping at his desk in a bankrupt studio, feeding a mouse in the dark, still making something. That mouse would become, in a few years, the most famous character in cinema history. But first, Walt had to hit the actual bottom. Laugh-O-Gram Films filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in July 1923. Walt needed train fare to Los Angeles. He went door to door, offering to film family home movies as keepsakes. He filmed a 6-month-old girl named Kathalee Viley. He sold his movie camera. That money bought him a one-way ticket on the California Limited, first class, because if this was the last thing he was going to do in Kansas City, he was going to do it right. He arrived in Hollywood in August 1923 with $40, a change of clothes, drawing materials, and an unfinished reel of film. He moved into his Uncle Robert's garage. No studio, no character, no contract, no prospects in the industry he had decided to conquer. So what happened? The same thing that always happened when Walt Disney was desperate and determined simultaneously. He wrote a letter. He contacted Margaret Winkler, a New York distributor who handled Felix the Cat. He told her about the Alice comedies. A live girl in an animated world. She was interested but required the same child actress in every short. Walt tracked down the Davis family in Kansas City. They moved west. He called his brother Roy out of the Veterans Hospital where he was recovering from tuberculosis. Roy was the financial mind to Walt's creative one, the man who kept the dream solvent long enough for it to become real. Without Roy, there is no Disney. On October 16, 1923, the Disney Brothers cartoon studio was officially born. The Alice comedies ran for 3 years, charming, profitable enough, not the thing. The thing came in 1927 when Charles Mintz, who had married Margaret Winkler and taken over her distribution business, told Walt that Universal Pictures wanted a new cartoon character, something with personality, something to rival Felix the Cat. Walt and Ub Iwerks created Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. The first Oswald, cartoon, Trolley Troubles, released September 5, 1927, became Universal's greatest success to date. Merchandise appeared almost immediately: a chocolate bar, a stencil set, a pinback button. Disney's studio grew to nearly 20 employees. By early 1928, Walt felt confident enough to travel to New York to renegotiate his contract. He had delivered a hit. He had earned a raise. He was not prepared for what Charles Mintz told him. "I want you to sit in this room with Walt for a moment." A New York office, February 1928. Mintz is across the table. Walt is 26 years old, still carrying himself like a farm boy, a quality that powerful men in New York have always taken for naivety and always been wrong about. Mintz is smiling. He does not want to give Walt more money. He wants to cut the budget by 20%. Take it or leave it. But that is not the worst part. Mintz reveals next, almost casually, that Universal Pictures owns Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, not Walt, not the Disney Brothers studio, Universal. The copyright, the character, the name, everything Walt had built belonged to someone else. He had spent over a year building another man's empire without knowing it, and Mintz has a very generous offer. Come work for us. Bring your team. Good salary, security. Stop being an independent operator and become a well-compensated employee of Mintz's new studio, which will continue producing Oswald cartoons using Walt's own animators, most of whom have already signed contracts with the new operation. You have to sit with what Walt is holding in that moment. He is broke. He has a brother in Los Angeles waiting for his call. His studio exists entirely at the pleasure of the man across from him. What he created belongs to someone else, and he has been offered a salary that would solve every problem he has. And he says no. He turns down the job, the salary, the security. He walks away from Oswald, the character he had built, the character he loved. He telegraphs Roy from New York. Don't worry, everything is okay. Roy almost certainly knew that nothing was okay, but Walt needed to say it. Some men need to say the thing they wish were true before they can make it true. On the train home to Los Angeles, Walt Disney, exhausted, humiliated, stripped of almost everything, begins to sketch. A mouse. Round, cheerful, simple. A character that he will own completely, forever, and share with no one. His wife Lillian was with him on the train. He showed her the sketch. He said he was going to call it Mortimer Mouse. Lillian said that sounded too pompous. She suggested Mickey instead. She was right about that, as she was right about most things. Mickey Mouse was born on the train home from the worst meeting of Walt Disney's life. Now, here is what happened to Charles Mintz. He kept producing Oswald cartoons without Walt, confident the quality would hold. It didn't. Universal grew dissatisfied and eventually handed Oswald to another animator, Walter Lantz. Mintz's studio closed. The man who had been so certain he understood where the real value lay ended up with nothing, while the farm boy he'd tried to reduce to a salaried employee built a $200 billion empire around a mouse he sketched on a train. Walt arrived back in Los Angeles with a new character and a vow he kept for the rest of his life. He would never again create something he did not own. That lesson, paid for with Oswald, with the bankrupt studio in Kansas City, with every 3:30 a.m. paper route in Missouri, became the legal and philosophical foundation of everything the Walt Disney Company ever made. The relentless copyright protection, the ironclad licensing, all of it traces back to that February morning in New York when a man named Mintz thought he held all the cards. He'd won the battle. Walt was about to build a different world entirely. The Mouse That Ate the World. On November 18, 1928, Steamboat Willie premiered at the Colony Theater in New York City. It was the third Mickey Mouse cartoon Walt had produced that year, but the first to be released, because it was the first to have something no cartoon had ever had before: synchronized sound. The audience sat in the dark and watched a cartoon mouse whistle and sing and use a goat's tail as a hand crank to play music, and they laughed, and they kept laughing. Because the sound wasn't just novelty, it was character. Mickey Mouse wasn't just moving on screen, he was alive. You could hear him think. Walt Disney provided Mickey's voice himself. That cheerful, slightly nervous falsetto, that was Walt. For years, every time Mickey spoke, it was Walt speaking through him. Now, here is the question: why did it work? What was it about a cheerful mouse that made the entire world stop? Because Mickey Mouse was not a mouse. He was an attitude. Small, and the world kept trying to beat him, and he kept bouncing back, grinning, improvising, refusing to accept that. The situation was hopeless. He was every person who had ever been told they were too small, too poor, too unlikely. He was Walt. Columbia Pictures signed a deal to distribute the Mickey cartoons. The studio grew. Donald Duck arrived, and Goofy and Pluto, each the product of Walt's insistence that cartoon characters had to feel real. Not funny, real. Funny gets a laugh. Real gets a devotee. By 1933, Walt had hired a merchandising executive named Kay Kamen. Within 2 years, Kamen generated $35 million in Mickey Mouse merchandise sales alone, more, Walt later said, than the cartoons themselves had made. A mouse on a T-shirt was worth more than the films. Walt had understood something almost no one else in entertainment had grasped. He was not in the cartoon business. He was in the character business. He was selling feelings. Feelings have no ceiling. But we still haven't answered the central question, the one we started with. What does it actually cost to refuse to be told what you're worth? We're getting close. But first, you need to understand just how high Walt had climbed, because the fall matters more when you understand the height. He announced that he was going to make a full-length animated feature film. The industry called it Disney's folly, not unkindly, rationally. No one had ever made a feature-length cartoon. The production challenges were staggering. Hundreds of animators, thousands of drawings per minute of screen time, a budget that ballooned from a planned $250,000 to nearly $1.5 million. Walt remortgaged everything. He borrowed against the film itself. He did not sleep for the better part of 2 years. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered in December 1937 at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. Charlie Chaplin was there, Marlene Dietrich. The audience watched a hand-drawn girl bite a poisoned apple, watched 7 little men weep over her glass coffin. And when the lights came, up, every one of them was crying too. The film grossed over $8 million, the highest box office of any sound film to date. During the Great Depression, when people had almost no money, they found money for Snow White. The Academy gave Walt a special Oscar, 1 full-sized and 7 miniature ones, presented by Shirley Temple. In his career, he would accumulate 22 Academy Awards and 59 nominations. No individual in history has won more. But the numbers don't capture what actually happened. A farm boy from Marceline, with no formal training and a father who thought it was all a waste of time, had just told a story that made the entire world feel something. Presidents screened his films, Eisenhower, Kennedy. Soldiers in the Second World War painted Mickey Mouse on their aircraft and bomb casings. Military units adopted Disney characters as their official insignia. A mouse had become a symbol of American optimism at the exact moment when the world needed something to believe in most. He had aimed at children. He had hit everyone. And then he made a new dream, the biggest, most privately personal dream of his entire life. He wanted to build a park, not a fairground with rides and concrete. Something new, a place where the stories surrounded you, where you could walk the main street of the small American town he had loved as a child and never stopped missing. The studios told him he was crazy. Roy had serious doubts. The banks would not lend him money. He sold his vacation home in Palm Springs. He borrowed against his life insurance policy. He struck a deal with ABC, a weekly TV show called Disneyland, in exchange for their investment in the park. The show premiered in October 1954. By the time the park itself opened, 70 million Americans already knew what it was. Disneyland opened on July 17, 1955, in Anaheim, California. Opening day was a controlled disaster. Counterfeit tickets flooded the gates. A gas leak in Fantasyland had to be sealed. Women's heels sank into the freshly laid asphalt in the summer heat. Mark Twain's paddle boat nearly capsized under the weight of the crowd. None of it mattered. Within its first year, Disneyland welcomed 3.5 million visitors. The Main Street USA at its entrance, every brick, every storefront, every detail, was a faithful recreation of the main street of Marceline, Missouri, the town a 9-year-old boy had left and never stopped carrying with him. He had built his childhood. He had made it permanent. He had made it available to everyone. The empire was real. What he was about to do to it, that's where the story gets complicated. When the dream started eating itself. By 1940, the Walt Disney Studio employed 1,200 people in a brand-new complex in Burbank, a facility with a restaurant, a gymnasium, a steam room, landscaped grounds. Walt had built it with the profits from Snow White, and he was immensely proud of it. He had given his animators a place worthy of what they were making. Here is what he had not given them, the money he promised. When Snow White went into production in the mid-1930s, Walt had made a promise to his staff, not in writing, made in the heat of collective sacrifice. Animators worked 6-day weeks, 7-day weeks, punishing overtime because they believed in what they were building. Walt had promised them bonuses, a share of the profits. Snow White grossed $8 million. The bonuses did not come. Instead, the money built the Burbank studio. Walt's own salary grew very large, and the animators knew it because studios are not good at keeping secrets. The pay structure inside had become, by any honest measure, chaotic and arbitrary. Some senior animators earned $300 a week. Others, doing work of equivalent quality, earned $12. Nobody could explain the logic. Requests for clarification went unanswered. Could it have been worse? Yes, Walt's animators still had the best conditions in the industry. He genuinely cared about them, or believed he did. But here is the thing about caring about people while breaking a promise to them. The care doesn't cancel the broken promise. It makes the betrayal more confusing, and confusion held long enough becomes anger. Then came the double blow. 2 films. Both of them would go on to be considered masterpieces. Both of them, at the time, almost killed the company. Pinocchio, richer and more technically dazzling than Snow White, cost $2.3 million and underperformed. The European market was gone. A war was being fought across Europe. Nobody was going to the cinema to watch a puppet learn about conscience while their cities burned. Fantasia, a feature-length marriage of classical music and animation, cost $2.28 million and bombed. Audiences expecting another Snow White sat in the dark, watching abstract shapes set to Stravinsky. Some loved it, most stayed away. By January 1941, the Disney studio was nearly $3 million in debt. The stock that had launched at $25 per share at the IPO in April 1940 had collapsed to $4 within the year. Bank of America was making calls. Salaries needed to be cut. People needed to be let go. And then, on May 28, 1941, Walt Disney made the specific decision that would ignite everything. He fired Art Babbitt. You need to understand who Art Babbitt was, Walt's highest-paid animator, responsible for some of the finest character work in Snow White and Pinocchio, sequences that animators still study today. A genuine artist, and a man who had concluded in the gathering storm of 1941 that his fellow workers deserved union representation. Walt had fought the Screen Cartoonists Guild for years. He believed his studio was a family, that the personal relationship between himself and his artists was worth more than any contract. He believed this completely. He was wrong. He had confused his own vision for his artists' well-being, broken a promise to them, and could not acknowledge either thing, because doing so would have required looking at himself clearly, and that was the one thing Walt Disney found nearly impossible. The morning after he fired Babbitt, more than 200 workers walked out. The picket signs were, you have to admit, brilliant. Snow White and the 700 Dwarfs. Are we mice or men? One genius against 600 guinea pigs. One striker stood on a hill in a beret at an easel, painting a landscape of the picket line as it unfolded below him. These were Disney's own people. They brought their craft to the protest. Walt, reading reports from inside his office, called it a catastrophe. He wrote to a friend that he had a case of the DDS, disillusionment and discouragement. He had built something he believed was a kingdom, and the people he'd built it with were outside telling the world it was a sweatshop. Both things were, in some measure, true. Could he let someone else take the wheel? Could he look at what had happened and accept his own part in it? The answer was no. He left, accepted a government invitation to tour South America as a goodwill ambassador, partly diplomatic, partly an exit from a crisis he didn't know how to face. FDR sent a federal mediator to Burbank. The mediator found in the union's favor on every issue. Walt signed a contract with the Screen Cartoonists Guild. All fired workers who wished to return were reinstated. But something had broken that could not be repaired. Not the studio. The studio survived. What broke was the atmosphere inside it, the belief in a common cause, the sense that this was a family. Walt had created that feeling over 15 years, and he had destroyed it in a summer by refusing to share the profits and refusing to hear what his people were telling him. He never fully forgave the strikers. Many of them never fully forgave him. The relationships that ended in 1941 ended permanently, and here is where Roy Disney quietly saved the company, the way Roy always did when Walt had dreamed or blundered them past the edge. Roy negotiated contracts with the United States military. Walt Disney Studios was commissioned to produce 20 war-related animated shorts for $90,000. $4,500 per short, well above their normal rate. Other branches followed. The Army Air Forces, the Department of Agriculture, the Treasury Department, training films, propaganda, insignia design. Scholar Gerard Wrighty would later conclude that without those military contracts, the Walt Disney Company might not have survived. And Dumbo, cheap, fast, deliberately modest, a film Walt regarded with some embarrassment because it lacked the technical ambition of his recent work, became a hit. It made people laugh and cry in the middle of everything. It made the studio money when the studio needed money more than it had ever needed it before. He survived, but the man who walked out of that Burbank studio at the end of 1941 was not the same man who had walked in. He was harder, more guarded, more certain of his own vision, and less willing to hear challenges to it. The studio survived. The dream survived. The man changed, and not entirely for the better. Survival isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a different one. The distance between Marceline and everything Walt Disney died on December 15, 1966. Lung cancer. He was 65 years old. He did not live to see Walt Disney World open in Florida. He had been quietly purchasing 27,000 acres of Florida wetland for years through dummy corporations, had drawn the plans and given the briefings, and stood in front of architectural models in his final months, describing exactly what it would be. Walt Disney World opened in October 1971. Roy Disney, who had stayed on to see it through, attended the opening and died 3 months later. He had spent his entire adult life making sure Walt's dreams had enough money behind them to survive. He did it one final time. At the time of Walt's death, his personal estate was estimated at between $100 and $150 million, roughly $1 billion in today's money. His stake in the company he had built with his brother was worth the bulk of it. He left 45% to his wife and children, 10% to his sister and her family. He was never a billionaire in his lifetime. He was something rarer, a man who consistently chose the dream over the money, who reinvested everything back into the next impossible thing. The empire was not, for him, the point. The point was what the empire could produce: the next film, the next park, the next idea no one had told him was possible yet, which was always the one that interested him most. He accumulated 22 Academy Awards, the most ever won by a single individual. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Lyndon Johnson. He and Roy co-founded the California Institute of the Arts in 1961, which remains one of the premier arts training institutions in the world. The Walt Disney Company today has a market capitalization of approximately $200 billion. It owns Marvel Studios, Pixar, Lucasfilm, which means Star Wars, National Geographic, ABC, and ESPN. It operates 12 theme parks on 4 continents and employs more than 230,000 people. The characters Walt built, Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Goofy, Snow White, Bambi, Dumbo, Cinderella, are among the most recognized images in the history of human visual culture. Children in countries Walt never visited, speaking languages Walt never heard, know these characters as intimately as they know their own families. And yet, for all of that, the thing I keep coming back to is a moment in 1956. Walt Disney returned to Marceline, the town he had left at the age of 9, 47 years earlier. He and Roy came for the dedication of the Walt Disney Municipal Park and Pool, and Walt asked to visit the farm, the old Crane farm, the cottonwood tree at the edge of a field. A woman named Inez Johnson, whose family now owned the land, took him there. The tree still stood. Walt stood at its base and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I drew whatever we saw. I could always count on rabbits and squirrels and field mice, and on a good day sometimes Bambi came by." The dreaming tree, they call it now, registered as a historic tree by American forests. Under that tree, a boy who was supposed to deliver newspapers and accept whatever the world had decided he was worth sat down with a stub of pencil and drew the world he wanted to live in instead. He drew it his whole life. Now, I want to come back to the question we started with. What does it actually cost to refuse to be told what you're worth? Here is the honest accounting. It cost Walt Disney a bankrupt studio at 21. It cost him a character he loved, taken by a man who thought he understood where the value was. It cost him 200 of his own people on a picket line. It cost him the trust of artists who had given him years of their lives in exchange for a promise he broke. It cost him something in himself, a softness, an openness to being wrong, that the crisis of 1941 narrowed and never fully reopened. That is the actual cost, not the Oscars, not the parks. And it produced, because this is always how it works, the most recognizable entertainment brand in the history of the world. The mouse he tamed in a bankrupt studio office and carried to Hollywood on a $40 train ticket is still the most recognized character in cinema. Mickey Mouse has outlasted every competitor, every cultural shift, every disruption that was supposed to make him irrelevant. He is on a screen somewhere in the world right now. He will be there tomorrow. When Mintz told Walt in 1928 that the artists were the real secret, that Walt was just overhead, just a name on the door, he was making the error that people with power always make about people with vision. He was looking at the pieces and missing the whole. Walt Disney did not draw the cartoons. Walt Disney was the reason the cartoons were what they were. Take away the vision, the standard, the refusal to accept less, and you have technically competent animation that nobody remembers. What Walt invented was not animation. Other people were animating. What he invented was the idea that a story, any story, told with enough care and enough refusal to compromise, could reach anyone, not just children, not just Americans, anyone who had ever been small or afraid or told that what they wanted was too much to ask for. That is what the boy under the cottonwood tree was drawing. Not animals, not cartoons, not characters. He was drawing proof that where you start has nothing to do with where you're capable of going. The empire began with $40 and a mouse. Always starts with less than you think and costs more than you expect and lasts longer than anyone said it would. It all started with a mouse and a refusal.